Okay, so my name is DORU, APREOTESEI, as you can see in the bottom left. This is going to be a bit of a special session because usually I do my introduction in the slides that we will see after these first ones. So this is going to be kind of like a Quentin Tarantino movie where you see a prologue and you don't understand what's going on, and then I do the introduction in the middle so you know who the hell I am. Thank you so much to everyone for coming here. This is a really good turnout. I'm really happy to see so many people be here to listen to me talk about myself mostly. I'm going to go through two things today, and we're going to have a lot of breaks because it's going to be a lot of information to take in. My understanding is that everyone who's sitting in this room more or less is in the process of actually making a game project. So I'm going to give you some tips that you will probably think that I should have told you 6 months ago. So yeah, here we go. I'm going to try to tell you these things as fast as possible so that you can facepalm and say shit. Okay, so first of all, I want to talk to you about something called the MDA design method. Has anyone heard about MDA design in the past? So anyone who's heard about MDA can raise their hands. Okay, cool. No one's lying at least, so that's a good start. So MDA, what is MDA? MDA is a design methodology. I don't know how much you guys have worked with design. I was told that you spend a lot of time actually doing the work with the coding and maybe making assets and whatever. MDA is mostly about design, about making a structure for your projects and your games. It's an abbreviation. What does it stand for? Well, the M stands for mechanics. Mechanics is basically, you can call them actions if you want. So the actions that are available to a player in your game, right? Now, the D is for dynamics. So another way of saying dynamics is gameplay. So it's the way that all your actions and all the different things that the game contains interacts to create the whole experience. And then the A is for aesthetics. It's a complicated word. Aesthetics, it basically means the emotional content of the game. So when we're talking about aesthetics, as I say, emotional context, you can look at aesthetics from two different perspectives. Number one, we're back to the old school whiteboard. One way of looking at aesthetics is to say that the player feels like Superman. And Superman, by the way, is the worst superhero ever. I just wanted no one to think that I actually like Superman. I actually hate Superman. But everyone knows Superman, so I'm using him as an example. So it's the guy with the hands and the stupid cape and whatever. That's Superman, right? So the player feels like he or she is Superman, correct? That's just one way of looking at it. Another one is to break it down into the more low-level emotions of what it means to be Superman. So for instance, it's supposed to be exciting. At least it's exciting for Superman. The rest of us are bored to death because he has no weaknesses. Except when someone comes with kryptonite, and that's always in the last 10 minutes of the movie, but never mind. So exciting, or let's say scary. Again, this doesn't apply to Superman because he can't die. Or I don't know, should we say, I don't know, awesome. So I just wanted to clarify that you can think of this last one in two different ways. Now this is going to be important later because depending on what kind of problems you are trying to solve in the game, you might have to have one or the other perspective, or maybe both perspectives at the same time. In some cases, you can look at your game and ask yourselves, does the player really feel like he or she is Superman? And that can be a very useful question. You might go, no, not really. I wonder why, and then you can try to fix it. In some other cases, you have to ask yourself, well, maybe we can't really put it at that level. Maybe it has to be, is the game exciting enough? Is the game scary enough? Is it awesome enough, right? So you have to think of aesthetics in more than one sense. Now, together, these three components make up games, right? like Super Mario or Uncharted or Journey or this fitness game that we have in the bottom right. So all of these are composed of and can be analyzed with this terminology. So it doesn't actually matter. You can design board games like this. You can analyze chess in this fashion. So it doesn't matter which kind of game you're making. Now, again, mechanics are the rules of the game, like I said, actions. The dynamics is the behavior of the game. So that is the combined output of the game systems plus what the players are doing. So basically, the dynamics is what you observe. If you look at a game, when you take everything into account, so all the actions that player 1 can actually engage in, all the actions that player 2 can engage in, all the actions that AI can engage in, all the things that can happen randomly just as a part of the game's rules. That's your dynamics right there. Okay, that's how it all plays out. And again, the aesthetics is the game experience, what the player feels, right? One way of looking at it is, like I said, the player feels like a super soldier in an action sci-fi universe. The dynamics, or the gameplay, I should say, supports that aesthetic. Now, this is extremely important because if you are trying to make, let's take a simple example. If you are trying to make a sneaking game, does everyone know James Bond? Yeah, very classic, another reasonably boring character. Anyway, the thing with James Bond is very rarely does he go through the front door. It happens sometimes, but he's supposed to be the guy with the tuxedo and the martini and going around sleeping with random people. You want a gameplay that supports the fiction you are trying to sell. The player is supposed to feel like James Bond. But if your dynamics, if your play experience is kick down the front door with a machine gun and kill 50 guys and then say something really stupid that's supposed to be funny, then that doesn't make you feel like James Bond. That makes you feel like any Arnold Schwarzenegger character or like Rambo or something. So this is important because if you're trying to sell to someone, hey, you're a cool spy, now take this machine gun and shoot 30 guys in 5 minutes, that's the wrong dynamics. Is that making sense? Right? And finally, the mechanics. That's basically it. The mechanics are the game's rules. So if you have a game that is supposed to work in a certain fashion, if you're trying to go for a certain dynamics and a certain aesthetics, you need to make sure that your mechanics support this chain all the way through. Now, this isn't super easy because as designers, we work from this perspective, right? We work from here. We work from mechanics. We have all the control over the mechanics. 100% control, right? There's nothing that happens randomly in our games unless we want it to happen randomly. We have 100% control. We have a little bit less control of the dynamics though, right? Has anyone played League of Legends? Hands up. Anyone play StarCraft? Anyone play chess? Right? There's so much stuff going on there that you cannot, as a developer, account for. I mean, whatever genius put together chess, put together the rules, saw that it worked, but the people who put together that game could not have imagined all the different potential games that were going to play out. And that's the same thing here. You can control the rules, but you cannot control how every game session is going to play out. That's why people still play chess, because they're still trying to figure that out, right? And least control of all we have over the aesthetics. Sure, we can fit everything in a wrapper. We have control of the assets, right? So we can make really cool graphics. Oh, we're going to do 3D graphics, and we're going to put the guy in the coolest James Bond suit ever, and he's going to have the Aston Martin and the Walter PPK. So we can do all this stuff to make it correct, but that's just graphics and audio and setting. Right? We have very little control over what the player actually feels. We have to kind of trick the player to feel in a certain way by creating game rules that make them play the game a certain way so that it's consistent with the fiction that we're trying to sell them. And that's really difficult, obviously. And the player, obviously, they go from that direction in the opposite direction. So as a designer, as a game developer, you're working from one side and they're working from the other side. And ideally, I mean, the best thing that can ever happen, if you're trying to get a player to love your game and have an emotional response to the game, you never want them to go past the aesthetics, ideally. Because the second the player starts to think about the dynamics and the mechanics, they're not in your fiction anymore. They're not being James Bond, now they're being some guy who's trying to break your game. So ideally you want to keep them inside the fiction as much as possible, and oftentimes when people stop playing a game and they think that something is stupid is when your fiction breaks, where they look at the screen and they go, oh, that's just terrible, that should have worked. Right? They die for some reason they couldn't have foreseen. The game doesn't behave like they expected to. It just takes them out of the magic and it's totally destroyed. Right? Now, one more thing that I want to mention. I know this is a lot to take in, but bear with me. There is one very important thing to remember, and this is something that you will find time and again, is that between these two, between the aesthetics and the dynamics, it's a bit of a two-way street, which means that the aesthetics to some degree influence the dynamics. They don't influence the mechanics. The mechanics are whatever they are. But the dynamics is the way the game plays out, right? And has anyone in here read anything about behavioral psychology? Yeah, okay. So what the thesis for a behavioral psychologist is basically that there is a holistic circumstance. There are a lot of factors at play besides the obvious ones for players to make decisions, right? So it could be, their mood of the day. It could be a million little things that we need to keep in mind. And in this instance, it's about the perception of the game's aesthetics. If a player is very strongly invested in the fiction, if the player really, really feels like James Bond, then maybe even if there is an exploit in the game, maybe there is this part of the game that they could solve by playing like Rambo, they're still not going to do it, right? They're not going to do it because they're so into the fiction. So if you have your aesthetics set well enough, and if you have your fiction well enough established, and if people are really enjoying themselves, then there is actually a chance that they will forgive some of your mistakes. So if you are 85% perfect, those last 15% will probably be okay too. You can't be sure of it, but sometimes that does happen. People say, no, I'm not going to do that because I think that that would actually be a bad approach. And they're going to be wrong, but they're so invested in the character that they're playing is that they want to stay in that role. So I just wanted to mention that you will find sometimes that players will not actually do something that you think that they should. You know that there is an exploit in the game. They know that there is an exploit in the game, and they still don't use the exploit. That's because they're so invested in playing like James Bond, they don't want to play like Rambo, even if it's a good idea, even if it helps them win. Okay, so that's something that I want to throw out there. And that's why it's so important to work in this fashion. If you give people a very, very strong aesthetic involvement, if you make them feel like they're really involved in what's going on the screen, then they will help you by playing the game in a certain way. They will forgive your mistakes and they will choose not to use certain types of exploits and whatever. So, enough about that. So, let's look at how this is applied. So, The Legend of Zelda. Who has played at least one version of The Legend of Zelda? Let's see some hands in the air and wave them like you care a little bit. There you go. Okay, cool. So, anyway, The Legend of Zelda. I use this as a basis for explaining how all of this stuff can actually be applied and what it actually means to observe a game from the MDA perspective and what it actually means to make small but very important changes. So I think most people can agree that The Legend of Zelda is basically a complete masterclass in how to do a game right. It's been the basis for so many other games. The thing is, if you look at the structure of The Legend of Zelda, there are a lot of games out there that are basically copying the exact structure, more or less, of The Legend of Zelda that people still don't think are copies. It's really funny. There have been only a very few number of actual Zelda copies, a lot more that people don't actually think are Zelda copies. So let me see if I can illustrate this. Let's say that you take the Legend of Zelda formula, you are adding ranged weapons. So instead of going around primarily and cutting stuff with the sword, I mean, he does have a bow and arrow and a slingshot and stuff, but most of the time he's going around cutting stuff up with the sword. Let's say you change the focus to ranged weapons, so shooting weapons, right? So you're focusing more on those. Then you have what we call twitch gameplay, so very fast gameplay, very small margins for error and stuff. And then you have side-scrolling and jumping. You basically get this. Anyone played those games? Metroid? No? Okay, so these are, Metroid games are also Nintendo games. They are side-scrolling adventure games. They're kind of like Zelda, right? They have these little world maps and stuff, and the structure is pretty much the same. But what's important is there is shooting weapons, there's the twitch gameplay, there's side-scrolling and jumping, and you get this whole science fiction feeling instead. But if you look at the game from a game rule point of view, it's pretty much the same as Zelda, but it feels completely different. Very few people have ever said that Metroid is a copy of Zelda. No one notices it because it's done so well. The aesthetic is completely different, and the dynamics and the mechanics support the aesthetic, so people don't see it as a ripoff. Another one is, let's say you want to make a horror game. Well, that's pretty simple. Anyone play Resident Evil? Everyone? That is Zelda, ladies and gentlemen, that is Zelda, right? Resident Evil is basically Zelda. What have they done though? They changed the aesthetic to horror, sure. But if you just added a few zombies to Zelda, would it become scary? No, because there are zombies in Zelda, it's still not scary. That's not what makes it scary. What makes it scary here, sure, it does matter that they do stuff like the static camera angles, for instance. You can't really move around your camera, and you have very limited resources. I think it's been mathematically proven that there are not enough bullets in Resident Evil to kill all the enemies. You are going to have to run eventually, right? It's a very small margin for error. You can die very easily in Resident Evil, which constantly makes you go around like this, right? And in the earlier Resident Evil games, there was also a limit to how often you could save, because you had these ink ribbons. Yeah, so you had ink ribbons. There was a resource, there was a thing that you had to use to save the game. So you couldn't explore one room and then run back and save and then explore the next room. And if you could do that, it's not scary. What happens to a scary game when you add quick save? You kill it. You add a quick save feature to a scary game that lets you press F5 and save wherever you want. It's not scary anymore because you're not investing anything, right? So there's not that much you have to do to destroy games. And we can continue working from there, right? So from Super Metroid, you can move on with slightly less focus on ranged weapons and adding RPG mechanics, and suddenly you have the Castlevania games. You have a lot of side-scrolling Castlevania games for the Nintendo DS system and stuff. I don't even know what genre that is, whatever the hell you call it. It's some RPG adventure fusion genre, right? But this makes sense. Right? These are kind of the same game, but they're slightly changing the aesthetic, so they make them feel differently. But it's not just about graphics. They also play very differently. It's not so much focus on the twitch. I mean, basically you can go through all of Super Metroid and not take a single hit, whereas in this game you can do that, but no one even tries because there's really no point. It's more of a stats game than anything else. Where Resident Evil, well, this is Resident Evil 1 that we have up there. Let's look at what they did for Resident Evil 4. Now you're getting lots of ammo drops and unlimited saves, and you have this precision aiming so that you can do the headshots and stuff. Suddenly that's not scary anymore. It's Resident Evil 4 and it's no longer scary. Why? Because you made a change in the mechanics, so you changed the dynamics, you changed how people play, and the aesthetic is no longer horror. It just can't be that, right? So I know this is a lot to take in, but when you think about it, it's just 3 steps. So this is where I open up for questions because I get tired of my own voice. So, questions so far? I'm on your time, by the way, so now's the time to ask questions. Come on, don't be shy, because the next part is an exercise where you have to prove that you've learned this. So this is where you ask questions. Yes?
Does all this mean aesthetic is the heart of the game?
The heart of the game? Yeah. So the question is, does it mean that the aesthetics is the heart of the game? I would say yes. The aesthetics is the emotion that you are going for, and it is what the player actually experiences. But from my perspective, I actually prefer to look at the dynamics as the heart of the game. Because let's say that you're going for a certain aesthetic. You don't hit that aesthetic, but you hit something else. You get a dynamic that is not what you were going for, but people are still playing it three hours in a row and not getting bored. Change the aesthetic, because you have a hit. You just didn't know that it was going to be that, right? You were going for something else, but it doesn't matter. Now you have a dynamic that people love. You should exploit that. You should actually use that. But sure, I mean, it's whatever you want it to be. If you feel like the heart of the game, from your perspective, it has to be this aesthetic, then yeah, that is the heart of your game. For me, I'm lazy. If I end up with a dynamic that really works, that is the most important part. Now, it used to be zombies, now it's butterflies. I don't care. Let's change it. So anyone else? Yo, you guys are so nice. Okay then, be that way. We're going to have an exercise now. Are all of you sitting kind of sort of in the groups that you want to work with? Because I'm going to have you guys sitting kind of sort of in groups and doing stuff together. So you can group yourselves up however you want. I don't actually mind. But here's the exercise. So how are we doing for time? Was that 15 minutes, 20 minutes? How long have I? 15, 20? We have hours, don't we? Okay, well this is excellent. Mine says 20 here. It's all good. Okay, so this is what we're going to do. Next slide is the actual exercise. So here's the exercise. Number one, think of a game. Ideally one that you have worked on or are working on, right? So this is good because you guys are already working on projects, right? So I would like you to take your own project. I think that's probably the most useful thing that you can do. If for whatever reason you don't want to do that and you want to work with some other game that you like, okay then. But it's probably better for you to use your own product. Now, number two. Identify the game's aesthetic in the two senses that we discussed before. Number one is, what is the fiction of the game? The player is a bear that really likes honey or something, I don't know. B, what are the emotional components of being a bear that really likes honey? Obviously hunger, but that's kind of difficult to do in a computer game. 3, identify the dynamics of that game. How is the game played? What does a typical play session look like? Yeah. Then you want to identify the mechanics of the game. Break it down in the actions. What are the actions that the player actually has available to him or her, right? And then finally, are the dynamics conducive to and consistent with the fiction, which are and which are not? In other words, you look at how the game is played and you ask yourselves, hey, is this consistent with what I am trying to make the player feel, right? And this then leads to the next point, which is, which mechanics should you change to improve the relationship between the play behavior and the fiction you are going for? So, a very simple way of looking at it is, does the player feel like I want him or her to feel? And if no, what can I change to fix that, right? So if you can put this in columns and say these are the aesthetics, these are the dynamics, these are the mechanics, and these are the ones that are working well and these are the ones that are working less well, that will be great.